How are you guys doing? Today is Thursday, December 10th, 2020, out here in this quarantine. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of the Elite, following the last day of group stage soccer for the Champions League, I'm just going to go through every single team that qualified for the next round of knockout stages. And briefly explain how the Champions League draw process works, and that's probably going to be either on Sunday or Monday next week, or Sunday this weekend or Monday next week, to decide which teams from the round of 16 will face off against each other in the first round. And I'm just gonna walk you guys through every single step of this Champions League process, because it's a very interesting season, and it started off with 32 teams and now it's dropped down to 16, and then by the end of February there will only be and by mid-March there will only be 8. So with that said, I'm just going to take you group by group just to show you how each team had gotten there to where they stand currently in the table. Starting off with Group A, the reigning Champions League winners, Bayern Munich from Germany, were able to secure a spot in the round of 16 after finishing with 5 wins, 1 draw, and 0 losses. In the first week, they beat Atletico 4-0. In week 2, they were able to beat Lokomotiv Moscow 2-1. In week 3, they beat RB Salzburg 6-2. Week 4, to clinch, in order to clinch the table, they beat RB Salzburg 3-1. Week 5, once they let some of their best players sit, they ended up tying with Atletico. That was their only draw of the group. And then in week 6, they ended up beating Lokomotiv Moscow 2-0. With 16 points in the group, they looked like a very, very strong side. And I imagine that any team that's going to get drawn, Bayern Munich is going to be in for a lot going through February. Bayern Munich is looking like a very strong side. The second team to make it out of that group was Atletico Madrid, who in 6 games, they finished with 2 wins, 3 draws, and 1 loss. Their only loss coming to Bayern Munich. Starting out week 1, they ended up losing to Bayern Munich 4-0. Their only loss of the group was pretty embarrassing, and it happened in Munich. In week 2, Atletico ended up beating RB Salzburg 3-2 in that group. That was their first win in the group to give them 4 points. And then Atletico ended up drawing with Lokomotiv Moscow, their first draw. Week 4, Atletico ended up drawing with Lokomotiv Moscow after neither team scored. Atletico ended up drawing with Bayern Munich, so they had 3 draws in a row in weeks 3, 4, and 5. And then in week 6, they were able to overcome RB Salzburg and beat them 2-0. So they ended up being second in the group. And Atletico Madrid, considering right now they're one of La Liga's strongest teams, and I think that if they're not first, they're probably 1 or 2 points out of first place. Atletico Madrid is looking like a very strong side when they're at full strength. Don't be fooled by the way they played Bayern Munich. Bayern Munich is incredibly good. I think they would go on and surprise a lot of other teams if they were to draw a top level club. They can give a top level club some problems moving forward, and they could definitely be a sleeper to make it in, considering their only loss came to Bayern Munich, the reigning champs. And Bayern Munich, we'll see if Bayern Munich is as strong if they end up facing Atletico Madrid in the next round. And then the team that got dropped to Europa League was FC Salzburg. They finished with 1 win, 1 draw, and 4 losses. So they finished with 4 total points in the table, which was enough to get them through. And Lokomotiv Moscow will be the team from Group A that drops out. In Group B, the winner of that group was Real Madrid. Real Madrid had a very interesting journey through. In the very first week, they ended up losing to Shakhtar 3-2. In week 2, they ended up drawing with Mönchengladbach 2-2. In week 3, they beat Inter Milan for their first win of the group. They had 4 points through the first 3 weeks. In week 4, Real Madrid ended up beating Inter Milan 2-0 to give them more points. In week 5, they ended up losing to Shakhtar for the second time. And then in week 6, Real Madrid ended up beating Mönchengladbach 2-0, which is a win that they most definitely needed. And right now, Real Madrid's sitting as one of the top teams in La Liga. They look like a very strong side. This is a team that's been through the Champions League before, probably one of the more experienced sides when it comes to Champions League, so I would never count Real Madrid out, especially the way they finished out this group on top when many people thought they would drop down to Europa League. Very impressive from Real Madrid, and they won their group by about 2 points. And the second team that will advance to the round of 16 is Borussia Mönchengladbach out of Germany. They finished with 8 points in the table. They had 2 wins, 2 draws, and 2 losses. Week 1 they drew to Inter Milan. Week 2, Mönchengladbach would end up drawing with Madrid 2-2. Those are their 2 draws. In week 3, they ended up beating Shakhtar 6-0. Week 4, they ended up beating Shakhtar 4-0, so that's a 10-0 aggregate on Shakhtar. Those are their 2 wins. And then in week 5, they lost to Inter Milan 3-2. And then in week 6, they would end up losing to they ended up losing to Real Madrid 2-0, but that was still enough for 8 points. And their 10 points over Shakhtar would give them the goal differential that they needed to advance to the next round. Shakhtar, even though they had 8 points in the table, they will get relegated to Europa League because they had 2 more points than Inter Milan. And I don't even know what I have to say, but Inter Milan with 6 points at the bottom of the table, they drop down, or they do not qualify for either Europa League or Champions League. In Group C, the top team out of that group was Manchester City, who's looking like a very strong side, especially in the Premier League thus far. They were pretty dominant to start off. In the very first week, they ended up beating Porto 3-1. In week 2, Man City would end up beating Marseille 3-0. In week 3, they ended up beating Olympiacos 3-0. Week 4, they ended up beating Olympiacos 1-0. Week 5, they ended up drawing with Porto at 0. And then in week 6, Man City ended up beating Marseille 3-0. They only had 1 draw, that 0-0 game. And then they would end up with 16 points in the table, just like Bayern Munich. They haven't lost a game in this group. They're looking like a very strong side going into the knockout stages. And Man City is not a team that I would want to draw first. And of course, they're going to be a very strong side. They've been to Champions League before, and they're prepared to give it their best. And then second place was FC Porto. They finished with 4 wins, 1 draw, and 1 loss in the group so far. Starting out week 1, FC Porto would end up losing to Man City. That was their only loss. Week 2, they ended up beating Olympiacos 2-0. Porto beat Marseille 3-0 in week 3. In week 4, Porto would end up beating Marseille 2-0 again. Week 5, Porto drew with Man City, their only other draw. They drew and lost to Man City, but in week 6, Porto would end up Porto would end up beating Olympiacos 2-0. That should give them 13 points. Their draw and loss came against Manchester City, but once again, don't underestimate Porto. Porto were able to easily dispose of Olympiacos and Marseille. I think once they get it all together, they can be a very strong team that can give any team trouble in this league. In Group D, Liverpool finished at the top of that group. Liverpool finished with 4 wins, 1 draw, and 1 loss so far in Champions League. First off, in the first week, Liverpool ended up beating Ajax 1-0. In week 2, Liverpool ended up beating Midtjylland 2-0 to give them 6 points. In week 3, Liverpool beat Atalanta 5-0, so they swept through the first week. Week 4, Liverpool would end up losing to Atalanta, their only loss of the stage. Group 5, Liverpool beat Ajax for the second time 1-0. And then in week 6, Liverpool, while not trying, would end up tying with Midtjylland. The only team they beat both times was Ajax, which kind of sucks for Ajax. But Liverpool with those 13 points, they finished at the top of Group D, and they go into the round of 16 looking like a very strong team when they're at their best, when they're at full strength. Atalanta finished second in that group with 3 wins, 2 draws, and 1 loss. Starting off with week 1, Atalanta, they ended up beating Midtjylland 4-0, which is a big win for them. They ended up tying with Ajax week 2. Atalanta in week 3 ended up losing to Liverpool 5-0. Week 5, Atalanta would go on to beat Liverpool 2-0 after they got embarrassed by them. Week 5, I said week 4, 5, but that was week 4. In week 5, they ended up drawing with Midtjylland at 1, and then finally in week 6, Atalanta would end up beating Ajax 1-0, which would have them advance past Ajax. Whereas if Ajax won, Ajax would be the second team in other than Atalanta, which is just to show you how strong of a team Atalanta is. In a pretty tough division, they were able to beat out Ajax, and Ajax is a consistently great soccer team. Ajax, with 7 points in the table, they now drop to Europa League as they had 2 wins, 1 draw, and 3 losses. As Liverpool and Atalanta gave Ajax a hard time. And then jumping to Group E, Chelsea was able to finish with the top spot in Group E as they finished with 4 wins, 2 draws, and 0 losses. Starting off in week 1, Chelsea ended up drawing with Sevilla. That was their first draw of the tournament. In Group 2, Chelsea ended up beating Krasnodar 4-0. In week 3, Chelsea ended up beating Stade Rennes 3-0 as they had 7 points after the first go through. And week 4, they ended up beating Rennes 2-1. Week 5, Chelsea would end up beating Sevilla 4-0. And then finally in week 6, they tied with Krasnodar. That was their second draw of the table. At that point, they had already clinched. And Chelsea's looking like one of the strongest sides coming in. Manchester City and Liverpool and Chelsea rounding out for the spots from the Premier League that have made it, as Manchester United dropped out, but I'll get to that in a second. Once again, Chelsea showing that the Premier League is still looking very strong and going into this. And Sevilla, the reigning winners of Europa League, would finish second in that group as they had 13 points in the table. They had 4 wins, 1 draw, and 1 loss on the season. Starting off in week 1, they ended up drawing with Chelsea 0-0, like I just said. In week 2, Sevilla would end up beating Rennes 1-0, which would give them 4 points on the table. Week 3, Sevilla would beat Krasnodar 3-2. Week 4, they beat Krasnodar 2-1. Week 5, they lost 4-0 to Chelsea. And then finally in week 6, to finish off their tenure, or to finish off their time in the group stage, Sevilla would end up beating Rennes 3-1, which would give them 13 points in the table and 1 point behind Chelsea. Both Chelsea and Sevilla are looking like very strong sides. Sevilla, especially after winning Europa League, just showing they're just being able to advance to the round of 16, looking like a very big feat for them, qualifying for Champions League for the first time in a bit, and finishing with 5 points in the table with their only win coming against Stade Rennes. Krasnodar will be delegated to Europa League out of Group E, and Stade Rennes will fall out as they only had 1 point. They only had 1 draw in group stage this year. Jumping to Group F, the top team in that group was Borussia Dortmund, who finished with 4 wins, 1 draw, and 1 loss this Champions League season. Starting out, they lost to Lazio 3-1, which was their only loss of group stage. In week 2, Borussia Dortmund would end up beating Zenit St. Petersburg 2-0, and then in week 3, they would end up beating Club Brugge 3-0 as they had 6 points to the first 3 matchups. Week 4, Borussia Dortmund would end up beating Club Brugge 3-0. Week 5, they would end up tying with Lazio, as Lazio gave them the most trouble this year. And then they ended up beating Zenit St. Petersburg 2-1 following all that. So they finished with 4 wins, 1 draw, and 1 loss. And Borussia Dortmund is looking like one of the Champions League's strongest sides, especially with Erling Braut Haaland leading the way. And they have their young core kind of just carrying them through. Borussia Dortmund's looking like a very potent team. And in second place, it was Lazio, who finished with 2 wins, 4 draws in the table. They had 10 points at the very end of it. And in their group stage, in their experience, first off, Lazio would end up beating Borussia Dortmund, the team that finished at the very top in week 1. In group 2, Lazio would end up tying with Club Brugge 1-1. In the third matchup day, they ended up tying with Zenit St. Petersburg 1-1. In week 4, they ended up beating Zenit St. Petersburg 3-1. In week 5, looking at Lazio, they ended up drawing with Borussia Dortmund in week 5, and then in week 6 they drew with Club Brugge again. Bruges and Dortmund gave them their 4 draws. I'm sorry, not their 4 draws, but they ended up having 4 draws on the season, which is what they didn't need, but they still were able to advance to the next round. Lazio's looking like a very strong side with Ciro Immobile leading the attack. And these two teams out of Group F are going to be some trouble to the teams that they end up drawing this weekend. Group G, Juventus finished at the very top of that group as they finished with 15 points in the table. They won 5 games and they ended up only losing 1. In week 1, they ended up beating Dynamo Kiev 2-0. In week 2, they lost to Barcelona 2-0 when Cristiano Ronaldo was out due to COVID. In week 3, Juventus ended up beating Ferencváros 4-1. In week 4, they ended up beating Ferencváros 2-1. In week 5, they ended up beating Dynamo Kiev 3-0. And finally, in week 6, they were able to beat Barcelona 3-0 as Cristiano Ronaldo was actually back and Juventus was looking like a full side. In second place in that group was Barcelona, who finished with 5 wins and 1 loss. They also had 15 points in the table. In week 1, Barca was able to go on to beat Ferencváros 5-1. In week 2, they were able to beat Juventus 2-0 as Ronaldo was out, which would give them 6 points in the table. In week 3, they were able to beat Dynamo Kiev 2-1 to go up to 9 points. In week 4, they jumped up to 12 points as they were able to beat Dynamo Kiev 4-0. In week 5, they were able to beat Ferencváros 3-0. That gave them 15 points through 5 games, and then they lost to Juventus 3-0, which would give them 15 points in the table. Juventus won the last head-to-head, and Juventus was able to get the number 1 spot in that group. And finishing with 4 points in the table, Dynamo Kiev with 1 win, 1 draw, and 4 losses will drop down to Europa League. And I didn't say this for Group F, but Club Brugge also advanced to Europa League. Zenit St. Petersburg finished at the bottom of Group F, so they won't advance. And Ferencváros finished at the bottom of Group G, so they will not advance to Champions League or Europa League. And finally, in Group H, just to show you how that group finished out, Paris Saint-Germain finished at the very top of that group as they had 4 wins and 2 losses, and they had a goal differential of +7. PSG had a very interesting road to get to Champions League because they fit earlier this year, probably like 2 or 3 months ago. They finished as the runners-up in Champions League, and following that, they hit a couple of rough patches. In the first match day, they ended up losing 2-1 to Manchester United, which would give them 0 points through week 1. In week 2, they beat Istanbul Başakşehir 2-0 to give them 3 points, and then in week 3, PSG would end up losing to RB Leipzig 2-1, so they only had 3 points through their first 3 matches. And then when you got to the 4th match, PSG beat RB Leipzig 1-0. Week 5, they ended up beating Man U 3-1. And then finally in week 6, they were able to beat Istanbul Başakşehir 5-1. That would give them the advantage that they needed to get to the next round, finishing on top of their table after being 3rd in the table following the 3rd week. And finishing second in that group was the Bundesliga's RB Leipzig, who finished with 4 wins and 2 losses in that table as well. Just starting off with week 1, they ended up beating Istanbul Başakşehir 2-0 to get their first 3 points at the table. And then jumping to round 2, they were able to, RB Leipzig lost 5-0 to Man U in week 2 when Man U was playing incredibly well. And then RB Leipzig in week 3 would end up beating PSG 2-1. Which would give them 6 points. Week 4, they ended up losing to PSG 1-0, which kept them at 6 points following week 4. But then week 5, they kind of kicked it into a new gear after losing to PSG. They ended up beating Istanbul Başakşehir 4-3. And then yesterday, or a couple of days ago, they ended up beating Man U 3-2, which was enough to give them 12 points and advance to the round of 16. With 3 wins and 3 losses, Manchester United with 9 points will get relegated to, they got relegated to Europa League, as they had an impressive season. They were at the top of Group H following week 4, and now they have fallen out. And Istanbul Başakşehir with 3 points, they have fallen out of their international tournament regimen. So, these are the 16 teams as I just went through. In Group A, you have Bayern Munich from the Bundesliga, Atletico Madrid from La Liga, Real Madrid from La Liga, Borussia Mönchengladbach from the Bundesliga, Manchester City from the Premier League, FC Porto from the Portuguese League, Liverpool from the Premier League, Atalanta from Serie A. Chelsea from the Premier League as they wrap up they're the three teams from the Premier League: Chelsea, Liverpool, and Manchester City that made it from the Premier League. Sevilla FC from La Liga also advanced. Borussia Dortmund from the Bundesliga. Lazio from Serie A. Juventus would round out the three of the four teams that made it from Serie A, as Inter Milan didn't advance. Barcelona from La Liga would be the fourth team from La Liga that advanced. PSG, the only team from Ligue 1 that advanced. And RB Leipzig is the fourth team from the Bundesliga that advanced. The Bundesliga and the Spanish, or in the Bundesliga from Germany and La Liga from Spain are the only two leagues right now where all of their teams that qualify for Champions League are making it onto the round of 16. Incredible feat. And with Serie A and Premier League being the two teams with three or four teams making it, it's going to be very interesting for them as well. And last year, the draw was less than a week after the teams have been selected. I believe that the draw will be next Tuesday or Wednesday, to be completely sure, but I have no idea. When it gets to it, I will do another segment then. But until then, I want to thank you once again for listening to all 21 minutes of my piece. I hope all is well. And peace out. I will catch you with Champions League content following the draw to preview just to preview both legs for the round of 16 for what teams I believe will advance to the round of 8. With that said, I appreciate you guys once again for listening to my piece. I hope all is well, and I'll catch you next week. Have a good one.